At 7:15 p.m. on the 3rd of April, 1860, a rider mounted a bay horse at the corner of Jules and 2nd Streets in St. Joseph, Missouri. He was carrying a leather mochila draped over the saddle, a specially designed pouch with 4 locked compartments for mail. The crowd that had gathered watched as he raised his hat, spurred the horse, and rode off into the twilight. It was the beginning of the Pony Express, a relay mail service that would cover nearly 1,900 miles in just 10 days. The rider was Johnny Fry, a 19-year-old weighing barely 120 pounds. The instructions were simple: ride hard, change horses every 10 to 15 miles at relay stations, and hand off the mochila to the next rider after 75 to 100 miles. The mail had left St. Joseph in a sealed pouch. When it reached Sacramento, California, it would be forwarded to San Francisco. The entire journey from the Missouri River to the Pacific was supposed to take no more than 10 days. The first day went smoothly. Johnny Fry covered the first 75 miles to the relay station at Kennecock, Kansas, in just under 5 hours. He changed horses at stations every 10 to 15 miles, each time grabbing a fresh mount and rushing onward. The horses were thoroughbreds and Mustangs, chosen for speed and endurance. The stations, spaced roughly a day's ride apart for the riders, were stocked with grain and water. At Kennecock, the mochila was handed over to the next rider, who continued westward. This pattern would repeat more than 150 times across the route, but the journey was far from easy. The terrain changed dramatically as the relay moved westward, from the rolling plains of Kansas, across the Platte River Valley of Nebraska, into the high deserts and Rocky Mountains of Wyoming and Utah, then over the Sierra Nevada into California. Snow, mud, heat, and bandits were constant threats. The Pony Express riders were young, light, and accustomed to hardship. They rode alone and unarmed for the most part, carrying only a revolver and a water canteen. Pay was generous for the time, about $100 a month, roughly 4 times the wage of an ordinary laborer. But the risks were high. Several riders would be killed on the trail, either by hostile tribes, accidents, or exhaustion. The first eastbound run left Sacramento at the same time. A rider named James Randall started from the western terminus. On April 13, 1860, the westbound mail arrived in Sacramento after 9 days and 23 hours. The eastbound mail reached St. Joseph after 10 days and 7 hours. The Pony Express had achieved what no other service had: transcontinental mail in under 2 weeks. The average time for a letter by the overland stagecoach was about 25 days. The Pony Express cut that by more than half. What made the Pony Express possible was a system of approximately 190 relay stations, 400 horses, and 80 riders. The riders were organized into relay shifts. When a rider reached a home station, his shift ended. The mochila was handed to a fresh rider on a fresh horse. The relay stations were small outposts, often just a single building, sometimes a dugout or a tent, staffed by station keepers who changed horses and provided food and shelter. The home stations were larger, with living quarters for riders and stock. The entire operation was funded by the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company, a freighting and stagecoach firm founded by William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell. The partners invested around $200,000 to set up the route and maintain it. The motivation behind the Pony Express was political and commercial. In the late 1850s, California was booming from the gold rush of 1849. The state had become a vital part of the Union, but communication with Washington took weeks. The telegraph lines had not yet crossed the continent. The only way to send a message was by ship around Cape Horn, which could take months, or by the Butterfield Overland Mail route through the Southern Territories, which took about 25 days. The central route across the plains and mountains was faster but dangerous. The partners of the Express believed they could win a government mail contract if they proved the central route was viable. They also wanted to demonstrate the superiority of their freight business for the coming transcontinental railroad and telegraph. But the timing was precarious. In 1860, the nation was on the verge of civil war. The southern states were threatening secession after Lincoln's election that November. A fast mail service linking California to the Union could help keep the state loyal. Many Californians had sympathies with the South, but the promise of rapid communication with Washington might slow those sympathies. The Pony Express became, in effect, a propaganda tool for the Union cause. The fact that it succeeded in its first runs made national headlines, and the service quickly became legendary. The early months of operation saw remarkable feats. In June of 1860, a rider named Bob Haslam set a record. He rode 190 miles in a single day, changing horses often, covering the distance between Smith Creek and Fort Churchill in Nevada. But Haslam was not alone in pushing limits. Riders averaged about 120 miles per day, often riding in brutal conditions. One of the most famous riders was William F. Cody, later known as Buffalo Bill, who signed up as a young teenager and once rode 384 miles in a single stretch because his relief rider was killed. Cody would later become a symbol of the American West, partly because of his exploits on the Pony Express. Despite these successes, the financial model was fragile. The Pony Express cost about $1,000 per day to operate. Revenue came from mail fees, $5 per half ounce initially, later reduced to $2.50. The number of letters carried was small, perhaps a few hundred per trip. The service never came close to breaking even. The company also faced competition. The Butterfield Overland Mail and other stage lines continued to operate. The government declined to give the Pony Express a mail contract, partly because the route was considered too dangerous and partly because the company's political ties were suspect. The partners, Russell, Majors, and Waddell, were already in deep debt from other ventures. By the fall of 1860, the company was losing money heavily. Weather made operations even harder. In November 1860, a blizzard swept across the Great Plains, burying relay stations in snow. Riders got lost. Horses starved. Some stations were abandoned. The company had to hire extra riders to make up for the gaps. Mail delivery slowed. Still, the Pony Express continued, its riders pushing through snowdrifts and below freezing temperatures. In the winter of 18606, the service never fully stopped, though some trips took up to 14 days. Then came the final blow. The transcontinental telegraph line was being built from both ends. Western Union, funded by the federal government and by the corporation building the line, was stringing wire across the plains and over the mountains. On the 24th of October, 1861, the line was completed at Salt Lake City, Utah. The clicking of telegraph wires could now carry messages from coast to coast in minutes, not days. The Pony Express had made its last delivery just 2 days earlier, on October 22, 1861. The company officially shut down. It had operated for only 18 months. In that short time, the Pony Express had delivered about 35,000 letters and traveled roughly 650,000 miles. It had lost money on every single run. The partners went bankrupt, but the legacy was enormous. The Pony Express demonstrated that the central route across the continent was feasible. It proved that a mail service could cross the Rockies in winter. It provided a model for the transcontinental railroad and telegraph, which would follow in the same corridor. And it became a symbol of American ingenuity, courage, and determination. The riders themselves became folk heroes, but the human cost was real. Riders died from accidents, from attacks, from exposure. The horses were pushed to their limits. Many were lamed or killed. The station keepers lived isolated lives, often threatened by Native American tribes who resented the intrusion onto their lands. The Pony Express was a product of its time, a brief, brilliant, and unsustainable solution to a geographic and political problem. The technology that replaced it, the telegraph, was more efficient, more reliable, and more scalable. Yet the romance of the Pony Express endures. The image of a lone rider galloping across the prairie, carrying a precious bundle of letters, has become a part of the American myth. The story of the Pony Express raises questions. How did a service that lost money and lasted only 18 months become so famous? Why did it capture the public imagination when so many other stagecoach and express lines failed? The answer lies partly in the drama of the ride, the speed, the risk, but also in the historical moment. It began just before the Civil War, when the nation needed a symbol of unity and progress, and it ended just as faster technology made it obsolete. The Pony Express was the last great romance of the frontier before the industrial age took over, but the mechanics of the operation were as important as the myth. The relay system, the station spacing, the horse rotation, the handling of the mochila, these were all carefully planned. The riders were chosen for weight and stamina, not for horsemanship alone. The horses were bred for speed and endurance. The route was surveyed with care. The timing was precise. The company advertised a 10-day schedule and most runs met or beat it. The system was a marvel of logistics, designed long before the term existed. The Pony Express also had a darker side. It brought violence to the plains. The route cut through lands occupied by the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Sioux, and other tribes. The stations were often targets of raids. The company's response was to arm station keepers and riders, which escalated conflicts. The westward expansion that the Pony Express represented was part of the dispossession of native peoples. The riders were not just mail carriers. They were agents of a larger force that would eventually destroy the traditional way of life on the plains. That is a fact that the romanticized version of the Pony Express often smooths over. Still, the service had its heroics. The story of the Pony Express cannot be told without mentioning some of its greatest rides. One of the most famous occurred in April 1860, just weeks after the service began. The relay had to cross the Platte River at a time when the ice was breaking up. The horse balked, and the rider was thrown into the freezing water. He managed to swim to the other side, clutching the mochila, and continued on foot until he reached the next station, where he demanded a horse. The mail arrived on time. Another rider, known only as Pony Bob, once rode 120 miles in a single day when a snowstorm closed stations. He arrived at the home station with his face frostbit, his horse near collapse, but the mail intact. The riders were often teenagers or young men in their early 20s. They signed up because of the pay, the adventure, or a desire to see the West. Many had no formal training in horsemanship beyond what they had grown up with. They learned on the job. The company provided a revolver and a carbine, but the riders rarely used them. Speed was their best defense. A rider encountering a band of hostile warriors would not try to fight. He would simply outrun them. The mail itself was a serious business. Letters were written on thin paper, sealed with wax, and placed in the mochila's locked pockets. The key was held only by the station keepers at the home stations. Not even the riders could open the pouches. The letters were usually government dispatches, business correspondence, and news from the East. Newspapers published special Pony Express editions. The service was expensive, but for urgent business or political news, it was the fastest option. The cost of a half-ounce letter was about the same as a week's wages for a laborer. But the Pony Express was also a propaganda tool. In the summer of 1860, the company carried a message from President James Buchanan to the governor of California. The eastbound run in November 1860 carried the results of the presidential election. The news of Lincoln's victory reached Sacramento in just 7 days and 17 hours. That speed may have helped keep California in the Union, though historians debate the exact impact. The Pony Express certainly made Californians feel connected to the national conversation in a way they had not before. The financial collapse of the company was swift. By early 1861, Russell, Majors, and Waddell were in debt by over $100,000. They had borrowed heavily to build the stations and buy the horses. They had counted on a government contract that never came. The Pony Express was sold to the Overland Mail Company in March 1861, but operations continued under the same system until the telegraph was completed. When the final run ended in October 1861, it was barely noticed outside of the small towns along the route. The riders simply stopped riding. The stations were abandoned. The horses were sold. The physical remains of the Pony Express are few. Some station markers exist along the route, but many were lost to weather, farming, and development. A few original machilas survive in museums. The riders themselves faded into obscurity, except for a few like Buffalo Bill who built later careers on their exploits. For most of the young men who rode for the service, it was a brief chapter in a long life or a short one. Now, more than a century and a half later, the Pony Express is remembered as a symbol of American grit. There are reenactments, annual rides, and even a Pony Express National Historic Trail managed by the National Park Service. But the real history is more complex. It is a story of improbable ambition, flawed execution, and enormous courage, set against a backdrop of a nation tearing itself apart and a continent that was still wild. On the night of May 21, 1860, near Box Elder Station in present-day Nebraska, a rider named James Pony Smith was thrown from his horse after the animal stepped into a gopher hole at full gallop. The machilla flew from the saddle, landed in the dust, and the mail pouches burst open. Smith, dazed and bleeding from a cut above his eye, scrambled to gather the letters. 2 of the 4 pouches had split their wax seals. He stuffed them back into the canvas, tied the bundle with rawhide, and remounted his injured horse. The animal was limping. The next station was 8 miles away. He had no choice but to walk the horse half the distance, then run alongside it carrying the mail on his back. He arrived at Box Elder at 1:10 a.m., 2 hours behind schedule. The station keeper patched his wound and gave him a fresh horse. Smith completed his leg of the run, and the mail reached Denver only 18 hours late. The company did not dock his pay. They could not afford to lose riders. What happened that night was typical. The Pony Express was not a single, heroic ride. It was a chain of fragile, desperate moments along 1,600 miles of unforgiving terrain. Every relay depended on a 20-year-old rider, a horse that had not been ridden to exhaustion, a station keeper who had enough feed and water, and whether that did not turn lethal. When any one of those links broke, the entire system faltered, and it broke often. The route itself was a study in deliberate risk. The company had chosen the Central Corridor through what is now Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California. That corridor was the shortest, but it crossed the Rocky Mountains in winter, the Great Plains in summer, and the Sierra Nevada in all seasons. Elevation changes of over 5,000 feet were common. Riders faced snowdrifts deeper than a man's height in the passes. They faced blistering heat on the alkali flats. They faced thunderstorms, hailstorms, flash floods, and rattlesnakes. And they faced people. The Native American tribes along the route had been pushed onto reserves or forced into armed resistance by the wave of settlers, miners, and railroad surveyors that preceded the Pony Express. The Cheyenne and Sioux, in particular, saw the mail stations as fortified outposts of the invasion. In the spring of 1860, raids began in earnest. Station keepers were killed, horses were stolen, stations were burned. The company responded by arming every employee with a Spencer carbine and a Colt revolver. Some stations requested military escorts, but the U.S. Army was stretched thin by the conflict in Kansas and the brewing Civil War. The Pony Express was left to defend itself. In June 1860, a party of Cheyenne warriors attacked the station at Rock Creek, Nebraska, killing the keeper and a visiting rider. The attackers stole 7 horses and burned the corral. The mail was not recovered for 3 weeks. Another attack in July targeted the station at Plum Creek, where a young keeper named Charlie Miller was shot through the leg while trying to saddle a horse. He crawled to the telegraph wire that had not yet been cut, the only surviving line along that stretch, and tapped out a message to the next station. The reply came back, "Hold out, rider coming." Miller held out for 2 more days with no food before the relief rider arrived with a carbine and a fresh mount. The mail was 3 days late. The company kept these incidents out of the newspapers. The image of the lone rider galloping against the elements was more marketable than the reality of a murder scene in a remote outpost. But the record of deaths among riders, station keepers, and hostlers is incomplete. The company did not publish official casualty lists. Fragmentary accounts from local histories suggest at least 16 riders died while on duty, with many more wounded or permanently injured. The horses died in greater numbers. A single severe winter storm in 1860 killed over 40 horses at one station in Wyoming. The company replaced them by buying remounts from any nearby ranch, at any price. The cost of horse mortality alone pushed the operation further into debt. How could a business that lost so many men and animals continue for 18 months? The answer lies in the founders' desperation. Russell, Majors, and Waddell had borrowed heavily from banks in New York and St. Louis. They had leveraged their personal fortunes. Every month they did not secure the government contract. The debt grew. The service was a public relations campaign as much as a mail delivery service. They needed to prove the route was viable, fast, and safe. They could not admit it was dangerous, expensive, and increasingly unsustainable. The riders themselves were as varied as the terrain. Some were orphans, some were college students, some were ex-soldiers. The youngest documented rider was a boy named Johnny Fry, who was 14 when he signed on in 1860. He lied about his age. The company did not check. Fry completed 32 runs without serious injury before he quit in 1861 to join the Union Army. He died in 1863 at the Battle of Honey Springs. The oldest rider was a man known only as Old Bob, who was said to be in his late 40s. He rode for 6 months before suffering a heart attack mid-run. He died on the trail, still holding the mochila. The station keeper who found him noted in the log, "Mail recovered, delayed 1 day." The pay was good by frontier standards, about $100 per month plus room and board at the stations, but the work was relentless. A rider could be called on to ride up to 120 miles in a single shift if a relief rider was sick or missing. The company promised no rider would exceed 100 miles, but the promise was broken from the first week. Riders who complained were replaced. There was no shortage of applicants. The horses were a different matter. The company used Morgan, Thoroughbred, and Mustang crosses selected for speed, endurance, and a steady temperament. Each horse was trained to run the same stretch of road between 2 stations repeatedly. They knew the turns, the water crossings, the soft patches. A horse could learn a 20-mile route in 2 weeks. After that, it was expected to cover that distance at full speed without spurring in less than 2 hours. The top-performing horses regularly beat the 2-hour mark. Some ran the route in 90 minutes, but the price was severe. Horses were pushed until their lungs hemorrhaged or their legs gave out. The company retired only a few. The rest were sold at auction when the service ended. A local butcher in Salt Lake City later recalled buying several Pony Express horses for pennies on the dollar. They were too broken to ride. The station system itself was a network of roughly 150 relay stations and about 50 home stations. The relay stations were simple: a corral, a small cabin or dugout, a single keeper, and a dozen horses. The home stations were larger, with a cook, a blacksmith, and sometimes a telegraph operator. They were spaced about 20 to 30 miles apart. The company built many of them from scratch, hauling lumber, bricks, and windows over hundreds of miles of rough road. In the winter of 1860, a blizzard buried several stations in the Sierra Nevada so deeply that keepers had to tunnel out to feed the horses. One keeper, a man named Silas Dunlap, survived for 17 days on horse feed and melted snow before a rider dug through the snowdrift to reach him. The rider was 3 days behind schedule. Dunlap later wrote, "I thought I was dead. I wished I was, but the mail must go through." The mail itself was sacrosanct. The mochila, that leather cover with 4 locked pouches, was designed to be transferred rapidly from saddle to saddle, but the locks were simple brass mechanisms that could be picked with a bent nail. Company policy forbade any station keeper from opening the pouches. The rule was enforced by a system of numbered seals. But keepers admitted to opening letters to read news or to remove cash that had been mistakenly placed in the mail. One keeper in Nevada was caught stealing $30 from a letter addressed to a San Francisco merchant. He was fired and told to leave the territory. He later became a stagecoach robber. The telegraph changed everything. The first transcontinental telegraph line was completed on October 24, 1861, just 2 days after the final Pony Express run. The line followed the same central route in many places, the same soil, the same passes, the same rivers. The Pony Express had proven the route was physically traversable in all seasons. The telegraph companies used that proof to plan their poles and wires. In that sense, the Pony Express was not a competitor to the telegraph. It was a surveyor, a pathfinder, a sacrificial offering to the gods of speed. When the telegraph went live, the Pony Express became instantly obsolete. News that had taken 10 days by horse now took minutes. Letters could still be mailed, but the urgency was gone. The company tried to reposition itself as a feeder service for the telegraph, carrying messages from remote towns to the nearest telegraph office. But the traffic was too thin. By December 1861, the Overland Mail Company, which had bought the Pony Express assets, abandoned all but a handful of stations. The horses were sold, the riders dismissed, the machilas stored in attics and barns. Many were used as saddlebags for mining mules. A few were cut up for scrap leather. The Pony Express might have been forgotten entirely if not for the Civil War. The war gave the service a romantic purpose. It had kept California in the Union. It had carried the news of Lincoln's election. It had symbolized the nation's reach across the continent. When the war ended, nostalgia took over. The dime novels of the 1860s and 1870s invented heroic riders, outlaws, and Indian battles. Buffalo Bill Cody, who had briefly ridden for the Pony Express as a teenager, built his Wild West show around the image of the lone rider defying the wilderness. The show toured the United States and Europe, spreading the legend. By 1900, the Pony Express was a national myth. But the facts remained stubbornly sober. The service lost money. It drove its horses to death. It put teenagers in harm's way. It accelerated the dispossession of native peoples. It was a technological dead end. Yet it matters because it represents a moment when human will collided with geography and emerged, briefly, victorious. The riders did not set out to be heroes. They set out to deliver mail. But the system they operated, the relays, the stations, the horses, the split-second timing, was a machine as intricate as any railroad, only smaller, faster, and more fragile. And when the machine worked, it worked beautifully. A letter could travel from St. Joseph to Sacramento in 10 days, across a continent that had no roads, no bridges, no reliable maps. That is not a myth. That is engineering. The final legacy is measured not in dollars but in the route itself. The central corridor that the Pony Express blazed became the path of the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869. That railroad brought settlers, miners, towns, and the eventual disappearance of the open range. The same corridor today carries Interstate 80, the main artery across the American West. The Pony Express markers along the highway are mostly state-funded plaques and weathered stone cairns, but the line on the map is still there. It is a scar on the land, a seam that held two halves of a country together for a brief, improbable season. In the end, the Pony Express was not a business. It was a demonstration. It showed what was possible if you ignored the cost, the danger, and the odds. The riders knew they were likely to fail. They did it anyway. And because they did, the West got smaller, the nation tightened its grip, and the telegraph, that silent web of copper and iron, laid the first threads of the connected world that came after. The riders rode into silence. The wires hummed, and the romance, for better or worse, never stopped riding. At 6:47 p.m. on the 24th of June, 1861, A rider named Samuel Hamilton left the station at Rocky Ridge, heading west with the mochila containing 40 letters and 3 newspapers. The evening sky was clear. The horse was a chestnut mare named Jenny, known for speed and a calm disposition. Hamilton had been riding for the Pony Express for 2 months. He was 22 years old. Within 2 miles, the horse stepped into a burrow hidden by sagebrush and fell heavily. The mare's left foreleg snapped just above the hoof. Hamilton was thrown forward over the saddle. He landed on his shoulder and rolled. The mochila skidded across the gravel. Hamilton got up. He checked the pouches. The locks were intact. He looked at the horse. The mare was trying to stand, but the leg bone had pierced the skin. Hamilton knew what had to be done. He drew his pistol and shot the horse in the head. Then he stood alone on the trail, holding the mochila, with the nearest station 6 miles behind him and the next station 14 miles ahead. He walked. He carried the leather pouch over his shoulder for the next 5 hours. He reached the station at Willow Springs just after midnight. The station keeper, a man named Ezra Todd, later wrote in the log, "Rider Hamilton arrived on foot, horse dead, male wet from sweat, delayed 5 hours." Hamilton was given a fresh horse and continued his run. He finished the shift 2 hours late. The company sent a replacement horse to Rocky Ridge the next morning. No rider had been killed. The mail had been delivered. But the incident was not recorded in any official report. It was routine. Hamilton rode again the following week. He was still on the payroll when the service ended 4 months later. What happened? That single broken leg on a June evening was not an anomaly. It was the system functioning as designed. Horses were viewed as consumable assets. The company did not maintain veterinary services at any station. Broken bones meant a bullet. The rider was expected to walk or run the rest of the distance if the horse could not continue. The mochila was the only cargo worth saving. The horse was not. This calculus was applied every day across the entire route. In the 18 months the Pony Express operated, at least 200 horses died. Some were killed by falls, others by exhaustion, still others by predators or starvation when stations were not resupplied. The company purchased approximately 420 horses at the start. By the end, fewer than half were still serviceable. The rest had been worked to death, sold, or abandoned. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the financial structure of the enterprise. The Pony Express was not a government operation. It was a private contract held by Russell, Majors, and Waddell, a freight company already deep in debt. The government paid $1 per letter for the first half ounce, but that revenue was never enough to cover the cost. The company spent an estimated $100,000 to set up the stations, purchase the horses, and hire the riders. Monthly operating expenses were about $60,000. Monthly revenue from the mail contract was roughly $30,000. The deficit was covered by borrowing. By the time the telegraph killed the service, the company owed over $500,000. That debt forced Russell, Majors, and Waddell into bankruptcy. The partners lost their other freight contracts, their warehouses, their livestock. William Russell was later accused of fraud in connection with government bonds and spent years in court. The Pony Express did not fail because of broken horse legs. It failed because the math did not work from the start. But the math was not calculated in horse lives. It was calculated in dollars and cents. And when a horse broke its leg, the company lost $200 of capital and had to buy a replacement. That replacement cost was simply added to the ledger. The riders understood this. Many of them wrote letters home describing the death of horses they had grown attached to. One rider, a 15-year-old boy named Billy Reed, wrote to his mother in August 1860, "I have lost 3 horses now. The first one fell and broke its neck. The second one gave out and they shot it. The third one stepped in a hole and I had to shoot it myself. I am tired of this work." Reed resigned the following month. He later became a cattle driver and was killed in a raid in 1864. The stations themselves were vulnerable to a different kind of failure. In the winter of 1860, the deep snow that trapped Silas Dunlap was not an isolated event. The Sierra Nevada passes received over 15 feet of snow that season. Stations at high elevation were cut off for weeks at a time. The company tried to keep a supply of hay and grain at each station, but the quantity was calculated for a normal winter. In December, several stations ran out of feed. Horses began to starve. Keepers fed them pine needles, bark, and in one case, boiled leather straps. The riders could not get through. The mail piled up. The telegraph was not yet operational, so the company had no way to communicate with the isolated stations. Riders who attempted the passes sometimes disappeared. One rider, a man named Charles Miller, left the station at Strawberry Valley on December 19, 1860, heading west. He was never seen again. His body was found the following spring, still frozen in the saddle at the bottom of a ravine. The mochila was still strapped to the saddle. The letters inside were dry. The company responded to these disasters with a simple policy: hire more riders, buy more horses, and increase the pay for those willing to ride in winter. The pay for a winter shift was raised to $150 per month, but the vacancies were hard to fill. Men who had survived one season often refused to ride again. The company began hiring younger and younger boys, some as young as 14, because they were lighter and could be paid less. The youngest known rider was a boy named John Fry, who was 13 when he started. He rode for 4 months before being thrown from a horse and breaking his collarbone. He was replaced by his younger brother. The system of relays, so carefully designed on paper, began to break down under the pressure of weather, terrain, and human fatigue. The company had planned for each rider to cover 75 to 100 miles per shift. But in practice, riders often covered over 120 miles when the relief rider did not show up or when the horse at the next station was lame. The records show that the average rider rode about 110 miles per shift in the summer and about 90 miles per shift in the winter. The animals bore the brunt. A horse that ran 100 miles at a gallop would lose 10 to 15 pounds in sweat and exertion. If the horse was not rested and fed properly, it would break down in weeks. The company's own veterinarian, a man named Dr. Ezra Hopkins, who was consulted only once during the entire operation, noted in his journal that the horses were being ridden into the ground. He recommended reducing the distance between stations to 10 miles. The company ignored him. The cost of building additional stations was too high. The financial pressure also corrupted the station keepers. Some keepers stole from the mail pouches, as mentioned earlier. Others sold horse feed on the side and replaced it with straw. Horses that were underfed could not maintain speed. The company attempted to enforce standards by sending inspectors along the route, but the inspectors were often bribed with food, whiskey, or cash. One inspector, a man named Phineas Cobb, was found to have accepted a saddle and a gold watch from a station keeper in exchange for a favorable report. Cobb was fired but not prosecuted. The company's reputation for honesty, which had been central to its branding, eroded. By late 1861, the Pony Express was known in some circles as the Pony Express robbery because of the frequency of lost or stolen mail. The most dramatic failures were the Indian attacks. The Paiute War of 1860, which erupted in May of that year, targeted the Pony Express directly. The Paiute people, whose land had been crossed by the mail route without permission, saw the stations as an invasion. They attacked station after station in what is now central Nevada. On May 8, 1860, a party of Paiute warriors raided the station at Williams Station, killing 5 keepers and burning the building. The horses were taken or killed. The mochila was carried away and its contents scattered. The company sent a posse of armed men to recover the mail, but the posse was ambushed. 9 men died. The mail was never recovered. The attack forced the company to reroute the mail through a longer but safer passage to the north. That reroute added 2 days to the schedule and required 30 additional horses. The cost was significant. The company petitioned the government for military protection. The army sent a small detachment, but it arrived 3 weeks after the worst attacks had ended. The Paiute War was not the only conflict. The Shoshone people also attacked stations in present-day Wyoming. In September 1860, a Shoshone war party burned the station at Green River. The keeper, a man named George White, was killed and his body mutilated. The horses were taken. The rider who arrived the next morning found the ashes and the human remains. He turned back. The mail was delayed by 4 days. The company did not rebuild the station. Instead, it contracted with a local rancher to provide a temporary relay point using his own horses. The rancher charged triple the usual fee. The company paid it. These failures were not hidden from the public. Newspapers in St. Joseph and San Francisco reported the delays and the attacks. The romantic image of the lone rider galloping through the wilderness was accompanied by grimmer headlines: Pony Express rider killed, station burned, mail lost. Yet the service continued. The company could not afford to stop. The government contract required a certain number of deliveries per month. Failure to meet the schedule meant fines. The company paid tens of thousands of dollars in fines over the 18 months. The fines were the final nail. On October 24, 1861, the telegraph line reached Salt Lake City. The line was completed at 1:30 p.m. local time. The operators on both ends exchanged formal greetings. The first message transmitted was a short sentence: "The Pony Express has carried its last letter." The company received news of the telegraph's completion the same day. The riders were informed at their stations the following morning. Most were told to turn in their horses and equipment. Some were offered jobs as couriers for the telegraph company, carrying messages between stations and telegraph offices. Only a few accepted. The majority left the service without any severance. The final rider, a man named Robert Haslam, completed his run on October 26, 1861. Arriving in Sacramento at 5:45 p.m., the mochila he carried contained only a few letters. The rest of the mail had already been sent by telegraph. The horse he rode was a gray gelding named Dispatch. The horse was sold the next day to a stagecoach company. Haslam later became a railroad conductor. He died in 1908, having lived long enough to see the railroad, the automobile, and the first airplanes. The Pony Express left behind a trail of dead animals, and dead men. But it also left a body of knowledge. The route maps were reused by the Union Pacific Railroad. The station locations became the basis for telegraph relay stations. The timing data, how fast a horse could travel over different types of terrain, was used by the military for planning cavalry routes. The system of relays itself was studied by the U.S. Postal Service and adapted for rural mail delivery. In that sense, the Pony Express was not a dead end. It was a laboratory for speed, and the human stories remain. The riders who died on the trail, the horses that ran until their hearts burst, the keepers who starved in snowbound cabins, all of them were part of a single, desperate effort to shrink the continent. They did not succeed in the way they intended. The company failed. The horses suffered. The mail sometimes arrived late or not at all. But the idea of coverage, that a letter could cross the country in 10 days, changed the way Americans thought about distance. It made the West feel close. And once the West felt close, the settlement could begin in earnest. The cost was already paid. What remains now is a landscape dotted with historical markers and a handful of original station buildings preserved in museums. At the Pony Express Museum in St. Joseph, Missouri, a rider statue stands in the lobby. The statue shows a young man leaning forward, his hand holding the mochila. The horse is mid-stride. Visitors walk past it every day. They read the plaques. They learn the dates and the distances. But the museum cannot display the fatigue, the fear, the loneliness that defined the real experience. Those could not be preserved. They can only be imagined. And in that imagination, the Pony Express lives on as something more than a failed business. It becomes a story about people who pushed themselves beyond the limits of reason. They did it not for glory, not for wealth, but because the mail needed to go through. When a horse broke its leg on a June evening, the rider walked. When a station burned, the route shifted. When the telegraph arrived, the riders disappeared. But the route remained. It remains today beneath the asphalt, beneath the wires, beneath the sound of cars and radios and cell phones. The silence of the Pony Express is not an absence. It is the foundation upon which the noise of the modern world was built. But to understand what was truly lost and what was gained, we must return to a single ride that captured both the ambition and the fragility of the entire operation. On the morning of April 13, 1861, a rider named Johnny Fry left the station at Rock Creek, Nebraska, carrying a mochila packed with newspapers, business letters, and a single personal note from a woman in St. Joseph to her husband in California. The note read simply, "I am well. The baby has your eyes." Fry was 21 years old, a former farmhand who had been riding for the Pony Express since its first month. He knew the route well. The terrain between Rock Creek and the next station at Sedgwick was flat and open, but it was also known to be dangerous. Just 2 weeks earlier, another rider had been ambushed by a small band of Lakota warriors. He survived, but his horse was killed. The company had issued no additional weapons. Fry carried a revolver and a knife. He was told to ride fast and avoid confrontation. At 7:45 a.m., Fry mounted his horse, a bay mare named Jenny, and set out at a gallop. The weather was clear. The trail was dry. He made good time for the first 6 miles. Then, at approximately 8:10 a.m., he noticed a group of horsemen on the horizon. They were not moving toward him, but they were positioned in a line across the trail. Fry slowed his horse. He later reported that he thought they were a military patrol. He raised his hand in greeting. The horsemen did not respond. As he drew closer, he saw that they were not soldiers. They were wearing buckskin and feathers. They were armed with bows and rifles. Fry turned his horse and spurred it hard. Jenny lunged forward, but the ground was uneven. The horse stumbled. Fry was thrown from the saddle. He landed hard on his left shoulder. The mochila fell off and landed on the ground several feet away. Fry scrambled to his feet, drew his revolver, and fired 2 shots. He did not hit anyone. The horsemen encircled him. One of them dismounted, picked up the mochila, and cut the leather straps. The letters spilled onto the prairie grass. The horsemen gathered the letters, tied them into a bundle, and rode away. They left Fry alive. He retrieved his horse, rode back to Rock Creek, and reported the incident. The company sent a search party, but the letters were never recovered. The personal note from the woman in St. Joseph was among them. It was never delivered. What happened to Johnny Fry that morning was not unusual. The Pony Express had no system for protecting its riders against attack. The company relied on speed and surprise, but those tactics failed when riders were caught in open terrain. In the months that followed, similar incidents occurred across the route. In May 1861, a rider named James Brown was killed near Fort Kearny. His body was found with an arrow through his chest. The mochila was missing. In July, a rider named William Carr was ambushed near Julesburg. He managed to fight off his attackers, but his horse was shot, and he had to walk 20 miles to the next station. The company praised his bravery but did not reward him. He quit 2 weeks later. The cumulative effect of these losses was a slow erosion of trust. The public began to wonder whether the Pony Express could actually protect its mail. The government, which had been considering a contract renewal, hesitated. The company's financial backers grew nervous. The company attempted to respond. In August 1861, Russell, Majors, and Waddell hired a private security force of 30 armed men to patrol the most dangerous sections of the route. The force was led by a former Army scout named Thomas "Doc" Holliday, no relation to the dentist. Holliday's men were paid $2 a day, plus a bonus for every attack they prevented. But the force was never large enough to cover the entire route. The patrols focused on the section between Julesburg and Salt Lake City, leaving the rest of the route unprotected. The cost of the security force was $10,000 per month. The company could not sustain it. By September, the force was reduced to 10 men. By October, it was disbanded entirely. The financial situation grew worse. The company had borrowed heavily from banks in St. Louis and New York. The interest payments alone consumed nearly a third of the company's revenue. The telegraph line, which was being built by the Western Union Company, was moving faster than expected. By September 1861, the line had reached Fort Laramie. The Pony Express could still carry mail faster than the telegraph in some sections, but the gap was closing. The company's only hope was a government contract that would guarantee a monthly payment of $100,000. The contract was never signed. The Post Office Department argued that the Pony Express was too unreliable. The Indian attacks, the robberies, the horse deaths, all of it made the service a gamble. The government chose to wait for the telegraph. On October 1, 1861, the company made a final desperate move. It announced a rate reduction. The price for a half-ounce letter dropped from $5 to $2. The goal was to increase volume and generate more revenue. But the lower rates attracted more customers, not more revenue. The company was now carrying more mail at a loss. The margin vanished. By mid-October, the company was losing $10,000 a week. The owners began selling off assets. Horses were sold to stagecoach companies. Station buildings were leased to ranchers. The leather mochillas were sold to a saddle maker in San Francisco for use as saddlebags. The company's office in St. Joseph was closed on October 22, 1861. The employees were given 2 weeks' notice. Some of them had not been paid in a month. On October 24, 1861, the telegraph line reached Salt Lake City. The Pony Express ceased operations 2 days later. But the story does not end there. The debt left by the Pony Express was enormous. Russell, Majors, and Waddell owed more than $200,000 to creditors. The three partners were personally bankrupt. William Russell lost his mansion in St. Joseph. Alexander Majors sold his farm. William Waddell moved to a small apartment in New York City and worked as a clerk for a railroad company. None of them ever recovered their fortunes. The Pony Express had been their dream. It had also been their ruin. The human cost was measured in lives. At least 40 riders died during the 18 months of operation. The exact number is not known because the company did not keep detailed records. The horses fared worse. Of the 400 horses that were initially purchased, fewer than half survived to the end. Many died of exhaustion, injury, or starvation. The station keepers also suffered. Some were killed in attacks. Others died of disease, exposure, or simple neglect. A station keeper named Samuel Jones at the station in central Nevada was found dead in his cabin in December 1860. The cause of death was starvation. The supply wagon had not arrived for 6 weeks. He had been eating his own horses. When the relief crew arrived, they found his body and the bones of 2 horses. The station was abandoned. But even as the company collapsed, the riders kept riding. The final week of the Pony Express was a strange, quiet affair. The telegraph had taken over the long-distance communication, but the company still had a contractual obligation to deliver mail to the smaller towns along the route. The riders carried letters that had been sent before the telegraph was completed. They rode through snow, rain, and wind. The horses were tired. The stations were poorly stocked, yet the riders did not stop. They rode as if the mail still mattered, as if the continent still needed to be crossed in 10 days. The last rider, Robert Haslam, described the final ride as the loneliest of my life. He said that the stations were empty, the horses were thin, and the trail was silent. When he reached Sacramento on October 26, 1861, the telegraph office was already sending messages. He handed over the mochila. No one applauded. No one thanked him. He went to a saloon, ordered a whiskey, and sat alone. The Pony Express was over. But the legacy was not. The route itself became a blueprint for the Transcontinental Railroad, which was completed in 1869. The stations became telegraph relay points. The riders became couriers, stagecoach drivers, and railroad workers. The idea of speed, of moving information across an entire continent in days instead of weeks, changed the way Americans thought about time. The Pony Express proved that the West could be connected. It also proved that the cost of that connection was high. Today, the Pony Express is remembered as a romantic episode, a story of young men on horseback braving the wilderness. But the reality was brutal. The horses suffered. The riders died. The The company failed. The mail was sometimes lost, and yet the system worked. For 18 months, a letter could travel from St. Joseph to Sacramento in 10 days. That was a miracle of logistics, endurance, and sheer will. The Pony Express did not survive, but its lesson survived. That distance can be overcome, that speed is possible, that the human spirit can push against the limits of geography and time. The silence that followed the Pony Express was not emptiness. It was the sound of a nation preparing for what came next. The telegraph wires hummed. The railroad tracks were laid. The West filled with settlers, miners, and farmers. The Pony Express riders became old men, then ghosts, then statues. But the route they rode remains. It is now a highway, a trail, a line on a map. Every car that crosses the Great Plains, every train that rolls through the Rockies, every message that travels the continent in an instant owes something to those riders. They did not know they were building the future. They only knew that the mail had to go through. On October 26, 1861, the last rider arrived in Sacramento. But the Pony Express did not simply vanish. Its physical remnants, the stations, the trails, the bones of horses, remained scattered across the landscape. For decades, the route fell into disuse. Then, in the 1910s, a group of historians began to trace the exact path. They found that most of the stations had been torn down for lumber. The stone foundations were buried under grass. The trail itself had been broken by plows, roads, and fences. The expedition, led by a retired postal inspector named William H. Jackson, mapped the route from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Jackson estimated that fewer than 30% of the original structures survived. Many had been converted into barns, sheds, or chicken coops. The story of the Pony Express was fading into rumor, but the rumor had power. In 1925, the Pony Express Trail Association was formed in Salt Lake City. The association's goal was to mark the route with concrete monuments. Over the next 10 years, volunteers placed more than 200 markers along the path. Each marker bore a bronze plaque that read, Pony Express Trail. The markers were placed at intervals of roughly 10 miles, the same distance between the original stations. The association also published a map. The map showed the trail as a broken line across the plains, the mountains, and the deserts. The line looked fragile, as if it could be erased by the next rain. By 1940, the Pony Express had become a symbol of American grit, but the reality was more complicated. The riders were not all heroes. Some were fugitives, some were drunks, some were children. The youngest rider on record was a boy named John Fish, who rode at the age of 11. Fish was hired because he weighed less than 90 pounds and did not tire the horse. He rode the section from Smith Creek to Simpson Station in Nevada. He later recalled that he was paid $25 a month plus board. He also recalled that he was beaten by station keepers for arriving late. He quit after 3 months. He never spoke of the Pony Express with pride. The horses were treated even worse. The average horse lasted only 3 months on the trail. The company bought them in bulk from ranchers in Missouri and Texas. The horses were not trained for the terrain. Many broke legs in prairie dog holes. Others collapsed from exhaustion. The company's own records, which were discovered in a St. Louis warehouse in 1932, show that nearly 100 horses died in the first 6 months alone. The records also show that the company paid a bounty of $5 for each horse that was returned dead. The bounty was often claimed by the same station keepers who had ridden the horses to death. The system was corrupt. The animals paid the price. In 1954, the United States Department of the Interior designated the Pony Express Trail as a National Historic Trail. The designation protected the remaining markers and stations, but the trail itself was still vulnerable. By 1960, only one original station remained intact, the Pony Express Station in St. Joseph, Missouri. The station had been converted into a museum. Visitors could see the original machilla, a saddle, and a few letters. The letters were yellowed and fragile. One letter, dated April 3, 1860, was addressed to a woman in Sacramento. The sender wrote that he had arrived in St. Joseph in good health and good spirits. The letter was never delivered. It was found in a mailbag that had been lost in a river crossing. The bag had been recovered in 1920 by a farmer who was digging a drainage ditch. The museum also displayed a list of the riders who had died. The list was incomplete. It contained only 22 names. Historians estimate the true number at 40 or more. The missing names were never recorded because the company's payroll records were destroyed in a fire in 1862. The fire occurred in the company's St. Joseph office. The building burned to the ground. The cause was never determined. Some said it was arson. Others said it was an accident. Whatever the cause, the records were gone. The names of the dead were lost. What happened to the writers who survived? Most returned to obscurity. A few became famous. William Buffalo Bill Cody, who had ridden for the Pony Express as a teenager, went on to become a showman. He used his Pony Express experience as a backdrop for his Wild West shows. Cody's version of the Pony Express was glamorous. He told audiences that the riders were fearless, the horses were unstoppable, and the mail always went through. The truth was different. Cody himself had been fired from the Pony Express for fighting with a station keeper. He later admitted that the job was the hardest work I ever did. But the showmanship won. The legend grew. Another rider, James Jim H. Davis, became a rancher in Nevada. He lived until 1907. In his final years, he gave interviews to local newspapers. He said that the Pony Express was not a romantic adventure. It was a job, a very hard job. The pay was low. The risk was high. The horses were terrible, but we did it because someone had to. Davis also said that he never told his children about the Pony Express. He thought they would not believe him. His grandson later discovered a box of letters in Davis's attic. The letters included a payment stub from June 1860. The stub showed that Davis earned $12 that month. The stub was the only proof that he had ever worked for the company. The legacy of the Pony Express is also measured in what it enabled. Before the Pony Express, the fastest way to send a message from the East Coast to California was by steamship, which took 3 weeks. After the Pony Express, the time was cut to 10 days. That acceleration changed the pace of business, politics, and personal life. A merchant in New York could order goods from San Francisco and expect a reply within 20 days instead of 6 weeks. A politician in Washington could send a message to Sacramento and receive an answer before the next election. The Pony Express did not just deliver mail, it delivered time, and then the telegraph took that time away. The Pony Express became obsolete in 18 months. But the idea of near-instant communication did not die. The telegraph itself was replaced by the telephone, then by radio, then by the internet. Each iteration shortened the time between sending and receiving. Today, a message can cross the continent in milliseconds. The riders on horseback, carrying a mochila through a blizzard, seem impossibly slow. But they were not slow. They were the fastest thing their world had ever seen. They pushed against the limits of horseflesh and human endurance. They proved that the continent could be connected and that the cost of connection was sometimes unbearable. The trail today is a quiet path. In some places, it is a gravel road. In others, it is a dirt track. In the mountains, it is marked by faded posts. In the deserts, it is barely visible. A hiker can walk the entire route in about 6 months. A cyclist can do it in 2 weeks. A driver can do it in 3 days. But no one does it for the mail. The Pony Express is gone. The riders are gone. The horses are gone. What remains is the memory of a journey that should not have been possible, but was accomplished anyway. And that memory is enough.